Um, Hi, everyone. My name is Imran Balodia. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor for Climate Sustainability and Inequality at Wits. I'd like to say how thrilled we are to have you all here today, and also to a large number who are online. So we really combining two events today. For those of you who've not been here with us, the whole day, we've been having an inter-faculty symposium on climate change research across the whole of the across the whole of the Wits system. And as part of the Pro Vice Chancellor's office, we've been hosting a series of high-level lectures on climate change. It's my great pleasure to introduce the lecture that we're hosting today, and it's really by one of our university's foremost scientists on climate change. So our speaker today, Professor Sally Archibald, is a professor in the School of Plant and in the School of Animal, Plant and environmental science. She works really on she works on the dynamics and the biogeography of savanna systems. Lots of her work has real practical implications. So, for example, some of her research really helps us to think about how to control fire in ecosystems, and she leads a large number of big international projects, including one on African ecosystems. She's going to talk to us today about an important dilemma that all of us who work on climate change need to think about, and that's the ethical challenge of balancing climate advocacy and science. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Sally.
Great. Thank you so much, Imran, for that introduction and for the opportunity to speak here today and for indulging my choice of topic. Is it possible to show the screen? There we go. So, just to sort of give a background of why I chose to talk about this topic. I'm a scientist. I do believe the science is important, but I also recognize that it is insufficient, especially when we stop with just doing the science and presenting the data. There's been a lot of research talking about this deficit model in terms of scientists present data, and then really the expectation of society is that we use that data and engage with the values of society and our values to try to make that data useful. But then we also have really strong values. I know I do. And so then we have a role. We want to be activists to achieve the change that we want to see in the world. But what is our role in terms of advocacy? Because we still need to maintain our credibility as scientists. So this is something that I'm going to focus on environmental science in my talk today, but I'd be really interested to hear how people in other disciplines have been engaging with this. I thought, seeing as I'm going to be talking a lot about values, I should have full disclosure and tell you a little bit about what my values are before I start. So I value diversity and I embrace variability, perhaps in a way more than many of my other ecologist colleagues that I interact with. Also, I don't see carbon as a measure of value, and productivity and growth are not ideals that I think we should manage our ecosystems for. And in that case, I might also diverge from some of my biological colleagues, but not all of them. I am really interested in using my knowledge to manipulate ecosystems to achieve desired states. So I'm not one of those ecologists who has a wilderness philosophy. And I do believe that these desired states are something that we should decide with society. And then I don't think that the climate crisis will be solved without massive restructuring of the global economic system. And so, in fact, I don't actually see the climate crisis as an ecological problem at all. And that is the source of some of my conflict. So a little bit of background. This is a paper published in 2020 in One Earth, where they just sort of looked through the scenarios of how to prevent warming to 1.5 degrees. Does this work? I wave my little, just have to wave my hand then. Huh? So in 2020, they had two scenarios. The one was we cut fossil fuels and anthropogenic emissions immediately, in which case we can get to 1.5 degrees without too much removal from the atmosphere. And the other one was we delay a few years, in which case, in order to remain at below 1.5 degrees warming, there has to be a massive amount of what we call carbon dioxide removal. So not only stop putting it into the atmosphere, but we also need to start taking it out at really rapid rates. So that was in 2020. And today we're in 2023, and really the world and the policymakers have woken up to the fact that actually we're in scenario 2 now. So carbon dioxide removal is required. Well, how to do carbon dioxide removal? The two main approaches are ecosystem-based approaches, which I will talk about today. And the paper said that these were mature in terms of their experience and their costs, because people have been thinking about them for many years. And then there is direct air capture, which we heard a great talk about earlier today, which they claim is becoming a scalable alternative. And many people have high hopes that it will help get us out of this problem. But right now, today in 2023, it's not, as we heard today, often something that can be rolled out yet. So this is what I've been watching roll out throughout my career, where I've been working in climate science. I've been watching this process of delaying reducing emissions continue and continue. And at this point, I think I've discovered this book a few weeks ago by Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And he presented these as options for people who are engaging with institutions and with organizations. But I have found it really useful in terms of understanding and reflecting on my process of engaging with this global problem. And up until very recently, I realized I have been engaged in a process of exit. I was deeply disappointed by the outcomes of the Paris Accord in 2015, where the decision was to go with a market-based approach to carbon credits and reducing fossil fuel emissions. And I felt that any engagement with the idea of carbon capture in ecosystems would draw attention away from the fact that we really need to reduce our fossil fuel emissions. But that approach of exit is no longer tenable for me for two reasons. Firstly, it's clear from scenario 2 that my demand that we reduce our emissions, even if we do it tomorrow, we still need to look at other alternatives. And then secondly, I have loyalty. I have loyalty to my colleagues who are deeply engrossed and entrenched in this complicated discussion about how we draw down carbon with our ecosystems. And I have loyalty to the Earth system and to the ecosystems, and I'm invested in ensuring that they are sustainable and have options for the future. So I have switched my position to trying to use my voice to influence this process. But then I come into a certain conflict. There was a certain delight in having the moral high ground of just saying it's someone else's problem. Now it is my problem. And my personal values are conflicting with my desire to be an objective scientist. So that's what we need to talk about today. The other challenge is that the expectations of scientists have really changed in the last few years. There is really a recognition that there's an urgent need for solutions to the climate crisis, and there are myriad perspectives about what these should be. but each proposed intervention really does need the credibility that science can provide. So our scientific credentials of impartiality and rigor, they become a commodity that we can impart or we can deny to our partners. The other challenge is that the funding landscape has really changed. So due to the particular mechanisms that the world has chosen to try to achieve change, areas of work like mine that previously fell under very different funding mechanisms, they were funded by benefactors or by national governments, they are now the focus of investment funding, with all the pitfalls and the benefits that this entails. So they are certainly flexible and responsive and efficient, but also ultimately they are motivated by profit. There are opportunities to make money out of carbon financing projects, and there are also opportunities to use climate financing to push alternative agenda. So the background to this, as I mentioned earlier, is that back in 1997 and again in 2015, the world tended to embrace clean development, the clean development mechanism and emissions reduction schemes. And so the alternative ways that we could have used to try to reduce our carbon inputs were sort of sidelined. There are some papers here. I haven't found any, you know, when people talk about these alternative measures, the first paper in 2020 says, you know, emissions trading schemes are one option, but there are other options. And then they reference papers back from 2007, because it really hasn't been part of the debate for at least a decade. But just note the quote from the Nordhaus paper, which is something that I think we need to discuss today. Right, so I've already mentioned, like, now that I've decided to have a voice, I have to be careful about my credibility and my credibility as a scientist, because the authority that science enjoys in public life stems from the idea that science is objective. It is an ideal, and it has proved to be unfounded, at least in some respects. But thanks to my philosophy colleague, Lucy, I did some really sort of reading about this over the last few weeks. And it really helped me to realize that the philosophers of science identify 4 stages at which values may affect science. So there's when we choose what to study, there's when we're gathering our evidence, there's when we're testing our evidence to accept the hypothesis. And then, of course, there is the sharing of those results with the world. And it's generally accepted that scientists are going to be using their values when they choose what to study. And of course, they're going to be using their values when they engage with how to share their results with the world. So we're only really expected to be impartial and have a value and 3 of values in the so-called process 2 and 3, which is a bit of a relief to me. It absolves me. I mean, we can discuss the complexity of whether that can even be value-free. But it does mean that this research results, which is actually a huge expectation. We are expected to demonstrate impact, and we're expected to engage with the social and ecosystem implications of our work. That actually all of those are value-based, and everyone recognizes that they are. Well, the philosophers recognize that they are, but general society still gives scientists a little bit more credibility, which means because I'm a scientist, I might be listened to more than someone not a scientist. So I still think it's for scientists to be honest about when they are using their data to achieve a certain goal, which they care about as human beings, and they have no scientific justification for that value. So the problem is that the world really wants to hear that natural ecosystems can be large carbon sinks in the near term. In fact, Johan Rockström has designed this term called the carbon law for nature, which offends me for many reasons, but he's really just trying to point out that if we want, like, this is how much carbon needs to be taken up by nature if nature is going to stay the way it is now. And then many people want to tell the world that natural ecosystems can be large carbon sinks because they want to solve the problem. They care about the problem. They also are motivated financially to get money to do this. And they also see some co-benefits for other things that they value. With so much at stake, the scientific approach is under some strain, I think, and we need to talk about it. I'm going to give you some examples. Here is an example relating to manipulating fire regimes. So we have just finished a really big assessment of the carbon balance of Africa. And our current estimate is that currently African wildfires emit 3.4 petagrams of CO2 equivalents a year. And just to give you some context, the huge wildfires in Canada that everyone is talking about, they have emitted about 1.4 petagrams of carbon equivalents this year. Those fires are large and emitting a lot of carbon, but our fires are really different, much smaller. So this is an example of a fire that's burning in Canada right now. Most of you have probably seen the types of fires that burn in Africa. They're a lot smaller, they burn a lot less carbon, but because there's so many of them in Africa, such a big continent, it ends up being a large flux of CO2 every year. Just some context, Canada's fossil fuel emissions are only about 0.6 petagrams of CO2 a year, but the global fossil fuel emissions are up to 40 petagrams. So, manipulating fire regimes potentially is a way to at least help reduce some of that carbon in the atmosphere. Even though it's important to realize that fires are carbon neutral, they're not adding to the problem, but potentially if we manipulate them, they could help us solve the problem. That's the idea. So what's the current knowledge that we have about African fire management options? I think the first question always to ask is is it possible to manipulate fire regimes in Africa? And we've done a lot of work on this. I'm just going to have to tell you the answer to that one. Maybe it is possible. We could certainly alter their intensity. And that would make a difference because we could just burn at different times of year and that would have a big impact on the type of fires. The next question is, will a reduction in fire actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And unfortunately, it is totally unclear at this stage. We know that it would increase tree cover, so that's an increase in carbon. But we have no evidence that it would reduce methane emissions, which are really key, because we have loads of data showing that even if we change the fire season, the methane emissions don't change predictably through the year. And we have no data that it changes soil carbon, because actually most of the carbon that's going into the soil in our systems is through the roots of the grasses that are very productive. So whether the grasses burn on top doesn't alter the soil carbon. Would reducing fire be beneficial to the ecology of the system is also an important question to ask. And that depends. Sometimes, but not always. And there will be winners and losers in terms of biodiversity. So that's our knowledge as people who study these ecosystems. The other important thing to realize is that geoengineering is one of many impacted when other interests come into their ecosystems. And so fire is used for many, many reasons, from livelihoods to conservation, and geoengineering is only one of these. So hence my frustration when a paper a few years was published that was suggesting that savanna fire management can generate enough carbon revenue to help restore Africa's rangelands and fill all of the funding gaps across all the protected areas in Africa. They were trying to tell a good news story. They did some calculations based on a global model that showed that they could change the carbon emissions from fire enough to earn enough carbon credits to give money to all the parks in Africa who are desperate for funding. And then they drew this cute little figure showing how the ecosystem would benefit. Everything would be better if there were different fire regimes. And the fire regimes now are making things worse. So we objected to this paper on 3 grounds. We objected to the paper because they didn't actually use any of the data that we have produced here in Africa over many decades. So even though the data were available, they didn't use them, so we don't trust their results. And then we objected to this assumption that changing fire will restore our ecosystems, because they didn't use any data to prove that also. And then we objected to the fact that there was no recognition that fire management already occurs in Africa. And we had a bit of a to and fro about it with the authors via the journal. So we basically said, your data collection and analysis were not objective. You weren't fulfilling that value-free ideal that scientists should have. But moreover, even, like, your data weren't collected well, but you also designed your experiment, designed your paper to achieve certain research agenda, and we don't share your values. It's based on values that we don't have. And they said to us, why are you purposefully obstructing an honest attempt to solve climate change? And this is a direct quote. They said, we hope your arguments are not intended to delay, prevent, or otherwise inhibit efforts to advance natural carbon solutions or nature-based solutions to climate change. So they were accusing us of being nature-based solutions denialists. And at this point, I should talk about this term, a nature-based solution. It's defined as an action to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems. That's address societal challenges effectively, benefiting people and nature. It's a highly contentious term, and we could give a whole talk about that. But it's now a prerequisite for all ecosystem-based funding. And I discovered the term boundary object recently. A boundary object is something that is interpreted differently by different groups, and yet it can be used by different groups, interpreted differently, to achieve collaboration without consensus. And so I think the word nature-based solutions probably could be called a boundary object. And so there's been a lot of pressure on scientists to be like, well, we have to find nature-based solutions, so we have to make sure that they tackle climate change, solve the biodiversity crisis, and contribute to sustainable development. Like, that's what we're expected to do. So am I a nature-based solutions denialist? I think I probably am, because I can't handle the term solution. If it was called a nature-based intervention, I would be able to join the fray. But the concept of a solution expects co-benefits. They downplay the fact that there are always winners and losers. And so I do think we need to switch the narrative from pursuing solutions that fix everything to assessing the trade-offs and deciding which trade-offs we are willing to accept. So this, I suspect they were right. I wasn't necessarily trying, I do care about the climate crisis, but I think that what they were doing wasn't help, because they were denying some of the trade-offs that were inherent in their solution. Just to say, I'm also not against manipulating fires in Africa. There are now 32 million euros for implementing fire abatement plans in Angola alone. So there's a huge green climate fund project. No matter what the authors and I argue about in the scientific literature, the money is pouring into Africa to put in fire management schemes. And the types of burns proposed are often what communities and conservationists want anyway. An example, a park I work in Kasanka in Zambia, they apply early season burning to prevent later fires. When I was last with them, I told them, you do know you could probably earn carbon credits for what you're doing here. And they were like, oh, no. We think we'd prefer to keep our autonomy and decide how we're going to burn our fires ourselves. But I did feel obliged to tell them that they could probably earn some money. And then in Nyasa National Park, where I also work, the communities ignite early fires when they're harvesting honey. And they have been vilified by many people in Mozambique for that. So if these sorts of fundings and schemes can help give these communities a little bit of support for what they are doing, then I'm not against it at all. So the second example that I want to talk about is rewilding and soil carbon. And it's quite a similar example. In this case, conservationists who worked in savanna ecosystems were quite aware of the massive amount of funding that was pouring into tropical forests for REDD+ activities. As I mentioned, now you can't really get funding unless you can show that you're a nature-based solution, but most of the funding for carbon capture was going into tropical forests because that's where the trees are. So they mobilized to demonstrate that savannas and grasslands can also be valuable carbon sinks. And they wrote all sorts of papers. There was a paper around how trophic rewilding can expand natural climate solutions, and savannas are overlooked carbon sinks. But they went further than that. They produced a verified carbon standards methodology based on data and models that they developed in the Serengeti National Park. And that is now a verified standard. There's an organization called Vera, which is used for private funding of carbon activities. And so they can if your project fits with the Vera standard, then you can earn carbon credits on the voluntary carbon market. So because of this, interventions manipulating, rewilding, changing grazing patterns are being rolled out at scale in many ecosystems in Africa and elsewhere. So this is an example where the conservation comes first and the climate carbon comes second, because the people who drove this were they're conservationists who want to achieve some conservation goals, and they just saw carbon funding as a way to do that. So you could call it a nature-based solution. The challenge again is that, and this is where I mean the problem with scientists is that we spend our lives with the type of uncertainty that we try to deal with and the type of uncertainty that the world would like us to manage are different. We spend a lot of time looking at process uncertainty. Do we understand how the processes work? And can we predict the consequences of certain interventions? But when it comes to many aspects of society, what people would like us to do is just provide a number with an error bar around it. So in order to earn carbon credits, you need to know how much carbon is going to be stored. We have a lot of understanding about how herbivores change all these ecosystem processes that can then result in carbon storage or not. But we haven't yet turned those into models that can be satisfactory for providing the number that is needed for someone who wants to invest in carbon. Potentially we still could, but we need to act now. We've just heard we can't wait a minute longer. So that requires action research. And action research is something I have used successfully and with great joy in various activities throughout my career. You identify the problem together with society. You develop a plan of action, you collect the data, you analyze the data, and then you discuss what that means with the partner, and then you rethink what your problem and your goals, and you keep going around, and you move forwards together while still doing research. So it doesn't require that you do the research first and then act. And so this is a good example where that might be a good idea to do. We do have some fantastic data sets that our colleagues have collected where they have information on long-term herbivore, like we have near the Kruger National Park, we have a range of sites that have with wildlife, with cattle, with different levels, with elephants, without elephants. We can collect some great data and test these models. But we are doing it with partners who are already rolling out this and speaking to landowners across Africa and offering them money to manipulate their herbivores, even though we haven't got the data yet. And the scale at which we're doing it is slightly unsettling for me, because action research at scale is a very different thing. And the scales are huge. There is a project in northern Kenya, the Northern Kenya Rangelands Project, which is aiming to remove 50 million tons of CO2 over 30 years. They have 14,000 communities that they're engaging with. They have this planned timeline of when and how things are going to be accounted for and when communities are going to get money. But they haven't actually nailed the process by which changing herbivores is going to store soil carbon. And Kenya has just come out of a 3-year drought where, models they developed in the Serengeti were not models that accounted for what happens when you've had an extreme drought for 3 years. So there are some really complicated decisions here. They've already started paying out money to the communities. There's no evidence that they've stored the carbon. It's become quite a political issue. So action research at scale, when you have really large numbers of stakeholders involved, government is involved, and then you have a lot of people who are expecting financial payouts, it becomes really tricky to do action research. Here's just an example. It's not only about the carbon, it's also about the social benefits. So this was sold as a nature-based solution. And if we could have done it at a small scale and tested how and where to engage with communities and whether the carbon would be stored, it might have been a really useful, constructive exercise. But it's become quite a political nightmare for the people involved. And then my final example is slightly different. It's around quantifying tree growth rates. So I've been involved in a network of scientists across Africa for the last few years who've been sharing our data. Scientists across Africa have been collecting data on how fast trees grow for many decades as individuals funded by our own individual research stations. But that data is more valuable when we share it. And so we have created this network of plots. We have 9,000 plots, but those red ones are the ones that really matter for this question. These are plots where we have repeat measurements, where we can actually, we've gone back to the same trees and we've measured them growing. It's a unique research infrastructure. It's the only infrastructure like this that exists in the dry tropics. There are many that in the tropical forests, but this is the only one globally. And it provides many benefits. It provides benefits to the scientists. We can do some really great science. We can also capacity build all of our students across Africa. But it also has really benefits in terms of helping communities design sustainable harvesting processes, natural resource management. We engage with governments in their national reporting. But the one that matters here is that we can really help calibrate and validate data sets for biomass change. And that is crucial for carbon offset projects because they need to prove how much carbon they're storing. So at the moment, satellite-based measures for estimating how fast trees grow are pretty useless. And I mean, I think it's really important to be honest about this. You know, the carbon law for nature produces numbers about how much carbon we can store in our systems, but they also need to realize that we're not really that good at measuring it. So this is 5 different satellite-based data products, just trying to measure how much the carbon stocks changed across some countries in Africa in the last 10 years. And they don't even agree about the direction of change, let alone the magnitude of change. Mostly, we believe, because only 3 of them are actually tuned to study our systems and calibrated against data in our systems. The rest are just global models that just fill the gaps for Africa. So there's the potential, if we provide our data, CSO, to these models, then we can really improve our ability to measure carbon. That's great, but the point is this data is now really financially valuable. In 2015, the price of carbon was $5 per ton. It's now anything from $15 to $30 per ton. People suspect that in 2025, it'll reach $50 per ton. So now our research network that was designed to do research has become something that has data which is really commercially quite valuable. So just in the last year, we have been approached by all of these partners to share our data or work together or sell our data. But the point is our existing data agreements weren't designed for commercial partners. When we put this network together, we never imagined that we were going to be engaging with finance and investment bankers and venture capital firms. So we have a process of sharing data, which is basically you email us, you ask us for the data, you tell us what you're doing, and we give you the data. But that's not really appropriate when the people who ask us for the data stand to make millions and millions of dollars out of it. And we haven't really worked out how to deal with that. Our current approach is to encourage all commercial ventures just to engage independently with the data providers. I suppose you could call that exit. We're just like, we can't, even though it's something that would be useful. And again, this is a problem because we have put in 7 years of work to make this data good. If they go back to the independent data providers, it takes them back 7 years. So we're not helping, but we have no capacity to engage on that level. And then we work with NGOs that share our values, and we engage with other NGOs, and we try to influence their voice if they don't share our values. But we always ask for meaningful engagement with all of the data owners and meaningful engagement with the application of the data products. But all of that takes a lot of time and effort. Like we are spending most of our time just engaging with the application of our data instead of doing the science that we think we should be doing with the data. So those are my 3 examples, and I just wanted to sort of draw some key lessons out from that. In terms of the African wildfires example, I think we really can insist on using better data and applying rigorous scientific methods. But ultimately, different interpretations of those data will result in disagreement about what constitutes a solution to climate change. And I think the solution there is for us, like I try to be very honest when I'm just giving my opinion versus referencing the data. And I expect all of my colleagues to do that as well. So I can expect my colleagues who wrote that paper to say, this is what I care about. This is how I want African ecosystems to look. example, I think the issues there are about using climate financing to achieve other goals. And I think much of the climate financing that is pouring into Africa is immediately being diverted to achieve other goals, because we're not quite sure whether it's going to store carbon, but there's lots of other useful stuff we can do with that money. And there's a lot of creative people out here who care about our ecosystems, who want to do useful stuff with that money. But if there's uncertainty in the outcomes, it might turn out to be a really bad idea, because we're going to lose credibility if we take this money, do all sorts of useful things with it, but it turns out that we don't store the carbon in the end. Everyone's going to be really, like, we will no longer have any voice at all in these discussions. So I worry that people who are doing this don't quite understand the social risks of doing action research at scale. Because if you don't know the consequences, then it could be that you end up with really bad relationships with all the people who trusted you. And then the tree growth rates example, it's just the complexity of commercializing environmental data that was collected for other purposes. And I think perhaps people in other fields have way more experience with this. If you work in the health field or in pharmaceuticals, this is something that scientists must have solved. It's just we, as environmental scientists, have never had to deal with it. But the other point that I want to raise from that is that researcher time is being diluted by engaging with all of these private companies. And I mean, all of my colleagues across Africa, the amount of time and energy that we're spending engaging with organizations who want to have some science backing to the interventions they want to apply in Africa, it takes a lot of time and energy. So this is where I've got to after having a fun time preparing this talk. And I suppose I'd like to open the floor to see whether other people feel I've come to a point that is satisfactory. If we use our voice and if we do objective science, then I think we can work towards ecosystems that provide options for future generations. And I think we can also remain honest about what can be achieved. I don't think we have to pretend like everything is a nature-based solution. We must just be honest about the trade-offs and explicit. But we can also keep the funders honest about their motivations. And I think that is really important and not being done enough. Like when people throw 32 billion euros at Angola, you must be like, what exactly are you wanting to get out of that? And is that justifiable? And all of that I can do as a scientist, stretching the limits of my value-free expectation, but still working within the idea that Max Weber presented of that four-step process of science. But then I've decided I can't leave it at that. I also need to be an activist, which means I actually have to step into realms where I don't have any expertise. I should be given as much credibility as any informed member of the public. But I feel it's very important that I use my voice to challenge narratives that the current crisis will be solved by geoengineering the Earth system. Even though I'm engaging with people who want to do that, I also need to say that I just don't think that is a solution to the problem. And that if we play along with people who say it is a solution, then we just encourage people to ignore the real decisions that need to be made about sustainability. So I would like to believe that I can do both, because I have skills to help and engage with the top area, even though I don't actually think that's going to make any difference. But I should still engage because that's where my skills lie. But then I also can't keep quiet about the fact that people are pretending when it isn't. So that's where I've come to. I'd be very delighted to hear your opinions. I wanted to take 1 minute to reflect on what this means for Wits. We've been having some great discussions within Wits about our sustainability strategy. So the first point I want to make is that I'm delighted that carbon removal projects are not part of Wits' sustainability strategy. It could be because we don't have any land, but either way, we're focusing on the real questions. But I realize that when it comes to Wits, we have the same problem. We have the need to push ahead with implementing some solutions. And then we also have people who are pointing out to us that those solutions, like putting solar panels up everywhere, are not engaging with the systemic problems. And in this case, I'm the one saying, let's solve the problem and start implementing some steps towards becoming carbon neutral. And it's someone else who's being the cautionary voice saying, actually, there are more systemic problems that we need to solve. So I think we need to do both. I think we can make a strong case for getting funding to achieve our net zero goals and starting implementing them like today, while also doing research that drives innovation. And so I think there might be some time to discuss that if you have thoughts on that now, but I suspect we could have more discussions about that into the future. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Sally. Those are some kind of pretty hard dilemmas to think through. And I think we've had the great benefit of kind of having someone who's really thought quite hard about these dilemmas, and kind of linked it up with the research. So I think I'm now going to open it up to kind of any thoughts, any questions. And I think, as Sally said, any observations anyone wants to share about how they kind of confront some of how they confront some of these dilemmas. So I think let's take to start one kind of question at a time. Maybe we'll start in the room first, and then shift kind of online. And I'm hoping, Julia, that you're going to help me with the online stuff. But let's see if there's anyone in the room who'd like to make the first observation. All right, I have two. So can we take two, Sally? All right, let's start with Lucy, and then we can go to Francois.
In your 4 points, those 4 sort of steps where the choosing your problem and disseminating your information were the value-driven ones. And that makes me wonder whether scientists in general, or at Wits, because probably most people don't know me, I'm a philosopher, so I'm in no way a scientist. Do scientists, when they publish their papers, declare where they were funded by? And do Wits scientists, when they write, for example, op-eds on anything to do with climate, declare any funding that they've had? And if not, shouldn't they?
All right, should we do Francois, and then you can answer both? Okay, Francois?
Sally, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and reflecting so calmly about these issues we're all grappling with. I would like you to maybe reflect on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's approach to this very big question you've raised about how to influence policy. Because I suspect the IPCC's approach in the climate space may not work so well in the biodiversity and ecosystem space, if you now reflect on what you've just shared with us. But the IPCC approach, for those that are not familiar with this, is to remain policy neutral. So the IPCC reports are designed to be policy relevant, but the IPCC itself never becomes prescriptive in terms of how the policy should be implemented. And having been part of the process, it works extremely well, because if you sit around the table with Saudi Arabia, with all its interests in oil, and the small island states who are directly threatened by sea level rise, you as a scientist are seen by the policymakers as a neutral and objective source of the facts. And they fight it out amongst themselves in terms of what the policy response should be. And this approach has led to the Paris Agreement on climate change, which can be seen as a tremendous success of science becoming policy. However, the policy has, of course, not been implemented. That's the problem. That the climate action has not followed the policy, because the formal policy endorsed by the United States, China, Saudi Arabia, Africa, the Africa group, is that the world should keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the Paris Agreement. But of course, the action has not followed on the agreement. But in terms of biodiversity and these complex issues you've raised, maybe that type of approach, given what sounds to be larger uncertainties, may even not lead to the right policies in our view as scientists being accepted by the country. So how would you compare the huge biodiversity issues and ecosystems versus the climate change issues when it comes to the science policy interface?
John. Yeah, thank you both. So to answer Lucy, definitely we have to report on our funders. It's expected by, I mean, the higher the impact the journal, the more they make sure you sign all these agreements saying, have you reported on all of your funders? So that is part of the process of publishing science. I forgot to mention that the paper, the Tier et al. Paper that we had the big fisticuffs, the lead author of that actually works for a carbon company whose job it is to, like, basically they make money out of carbon projects. So they didn't disclose their funding, but if you look at what their address is a company that is designed to implement carbon projects, and that's how they make their money. I think we could do more, though, to encourage scientists not only to mention who their funders are, because that's quite a simple thing, but to be honest about, like, you know, where they stand on some of these key issues. Unfortunately, it's more the other way around. I actually I tried to do a bit of a meta-analysis a few days ago, because these days, in order to publish in a high impact journal, you actually need to present your data in a way that addresses some important impact. You can't any longer. So an example of a postdoc that I know, he studied in the Kruger Park and he looked at how fires affect soil carbon. And he could have just written a paper saying, you know, fire frequency affects soil carbon this much. But instead he wrote a paper, he wanted to publish it in Science, which he ended up doing. But his paper, the title was incredibly inflammatory and everyone got very angry with him because he's like, you know, carbon projects, like, to talking about how fire reduces carbon is overinflated. And so basically it's more that the journals, especially the high impact journals, now expect you to put this sort of twist on your science and make it to take away from its value-free nature. And I think his paper would have been a much better science paper if he just presented the facts, actually. Then he could have written a media paper about what he thinks the facts are. Which maybe, I suppose, follows on to Francois' comment. I mean, that just sounds delightful to me, as you just present the data and then everyone else decides what it means. But I think clearly that's not going to cut it with society for most circumstances. Maybe in the situation of the IPCC, that is the approved way of doing it, because the policymakers, it's their job to be informed and to go and take your science and use it and think about it. But the paper that I referenced that Lucy shared with me around the sort of deficit is about the fact that no, actually we're expected to reach out to society, find out what they value, think about how we can communicate what we value and what our science is. Like, that's part of our job, unfortunately, because it's really hard to do. Just to mention in terms of biodiversity versus the IPCC, so Bob Scholes, who passed away a few years ago, he chaired a workshop where the IPCC and IPBES, which is the biodiversity kind of organization, really address these issues that I deal with here, is like, under what conditions is climate and biodiversity aligned, and under what conditions are they actually pursue different goals? And I would recommend anyone reads that who's interested. And I wanted to make one final point, Francois, but I've forgotten what it was. So, yeah.
I'm really sort of observing the kind of the rules I set. I said we'd start with one question at a time and then promptly kind of allow two, but I'm going to try kind of a bit harder to keep to the rules. So we'd like to do a set of questions here and a set of questions online so that we're fair to everyone. So I'm going to shift online now and ask Julia to read out 2 questions. Come over to you, Julia.
Great, thank you. So the first question is from Mpilo Kumalo, who says, nature-based solutions sound like really interesting interventions, but they sound like they are more focused on climate change. Are they also linked to other problems such as food insecurity, potable water availability, other ecosystem services? Thank you. And then another question from Naziru Salisu. During your discussion, you have mentioned estimation of tree growth rates using satellites data for the assessment of carbon sequestration. For the last 3 years, I'm passionate to conduct this research in Nigeria, Savannah, but up to now I haven't seen comprehensive and standard methods that can guide me to do it. Can you provide any more information?
Yeah, thank you, Mpilo. I think that's one of the reasons this concept is contested, which is that the initial term was natural climate solutions, and then they realized that because of many of the issues we've heard today, they really need to recognize that these interventions are going to engage and with ecosystems where humans live. It was turned into this nature-based solutions, but people still are suspicious of it because they think it's coming really with a climate mitigation angle and it's all about carbon, and they've just added society and biodiversity on the end to make it look better. And that's the cause of some of the contention. But the way it's defined now and the way we really need to embrace it and use it, if that's the word that we have, is something that embraces water provision, food security, any intervention that can have co-benefits for society and climate and the environment is something that could be called a nature-based solution. And then the next question is, yeah, you'll notice that our network is currently only in Southern Africa, but we are actually engaging with colleagues in Ghana about kind of sharing data, because I'm sure there are some really great long-term plot networks there. And so I'd be delighted to get in touch and expand it to Nigeria as well.
Great, let's come back to the room here. So I have two hands up, from Lynn and then from Mike. So let's start with Lynn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sally. Fascinating and wonderful to have such deep thinking scientists at Wits. So well done. I wanted to comment on the data issue, because yeah, in health sciences, obviously we do deal a lot with the issues of data and ethics, confidentiality, because obviously it's human data, but increasingly, when you do publish, you actually have to provide your data sets, just, so, and definitely on the funding issue, absolutely, you have to declare your funding and any conflicts. But so that's possibly somewhere where it can go, because one does want to share data. Data should be, it should be available, especially if it's going to be used to inform, next steps, and data should be widely available. But with regards to commercial people, wanting data for commercial purposes, and this dilemma about whether you sell data or not, one of the things that they've done, and in fact, it's sort of genetics research where the data is human genetic data, is that they set up these things called benefit sharing arrangements, so that a commercial company, so they're not actually buying the data, but they have to do some kind of community project, so the community from. It obviously takes a different level of engagement, but actually it's proven to be quite successful, because then the community sees the direct benefit of the research. Now, I guess it's a bit harder because maybe your community is not so easy to define because it's trees and grasslands and things, but just to think around that actually commercial companies can invest in other ways without actually paying you for the data, which I agree does, but so, there's a lot of, certainly in the health sciences, there's a lot of thinking around these issues, and it might be worth touching base with them and the ethics office.
Great, thank you so much. Can I answer that one? Can I respond to that one? Because
Okay,
it wasn't a
fine.
question. That's really helpful. And in fact, that's how we've been in the moment is when, so there's an organization called NCEO. They would like our data. We're like, can you help fund a researcher? So it's become some sort of collaborative arrangement where the data owners benefit. The challenge with making this sort of data free is around the equality issue, which is that the people who have the capacity to use it are not the people who collected it. And there's been a lot of discussion around that. So the tropical networks, I mentioned there are many of them, there's Trobit and AfriTrop. Their approach is, we are not going to share our data with you because we protect our scientists in these African and South American countries. And so, while data should be shared to make progress, there's also the equality issue, which is that people in Europe and China and America have so much more capacity to use that data, even within science. We're not even talking commercialization, that it would be unfair to make it freely available because then the scientists who collected it will not get the benefit. It is a complicated challenge. But I do like the idea of some sort of formal arrangement. But like you say, it takes time and energy to make that happen. So again, it's a bit of advocacy, but certainly I think it will be worth it.
Great. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks. I am going to ask about something else, but it really does strike me that you are halfway to a solution on this data issue, but perhaps we need to frame it slightly differently. The just transition is about everyone taking fair share of responsibility and carrying a fair share of the cost, but getting some of the benefits. And I just wonder whether there isn't more organization and mobilization of that community needed, preferably by somebody who's dedicated to it. So you don't do it in your spare time. You have people doing it, like the venture capitalists do. They have a bunch of people who are mobilizing these opportunities and not necessarily doing the science, but they're making sure that they have that. And I just miss that. You seem to be a sort of, and this is the danger of science. You're an amorphous group of people. You don't really want to, you work on your own, but you're actually working within an organized global space, which is set up to exploit you. And if you don't respond to it, don't complain. So it really strikes, it's really striking that you don't have a better structured organization to deal with it. And I think the biomedical area has had to do that and perhaps does provide you the mechanisms. Now, can I get to my question, please? I'm concerned about this, the subjects which are part of sanctioned discourse, and having engaged in the question around wetlands and their methane emissions, which are now, I think, thanks to a large amount of rainfall in sort of Central Africa, there was a huge bubble of methane which everyone couldn't ignore and has actually had global impact. As far as I know, the global methane emissions are now a serious concern, and it is clear that African wetlands are part of that. Now, we can manage at a much smaller scale methane emissions by managing water resources, but then you immediately run into a group of environmentalists who have a different set of values. They tend to be northern environmentalists who don't want wetlands to be disturbed, who don't want natural rivers to be interrupted. And one has to ask, how do we try and ensure that externally imposed discourse? Now, you can't talk about methane reduction from wetlands. You can talk about it from all sorts of very, very small sources. How can we try and put that back on the agenda? Because when we actually look at the African opportunities, we have substantial opportunities. I did the work just on wetland, which said we can fund $200 million worth of rural development that happens to be in Sudan simply by managing Nile floods slightly better. But that is, as I say, it's completely outside of sanctioned discourse. You are really not allowed to talk about that in polite company. We need to somehow change that because the discourse is being authorized by the North rather than by the people concerned. And that really is a concern. This is a sort of activist concern. We have potential solutions. Are we allowed to talk about them? Are we allowed to test them? Who decides and how?
I think that's a great fourth example of exactly the same issues that I was trying to raise. right, the issue of being imposed on by other people's values, I think if you can do the experiments at small scale and demonstrate what the potential is, but ultimately, as you point out, there are going to be consequences, and somehow society has to decide whether those consequences are worth it. Like the ecosystem will change if you alter how the floods work. Is that a trade-off that we are willing to make for the sake of earning money and reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere? But if we make that trade-off explicit and we allow voices from the local communities all the way up to Johan Rockstrom in Sweden to discuss it, maybe we can come to some kind of decision that is at least, even it won't be a solution because there's going to be trade-offs, but at least it is something that got buy-in from the largest number of stakeholders possible. I remember what I wanted to ask Francois. I was going to say, Francois, what happened if you come there, you present the data, negotiate, and they're like, oh, we don't care about global warming, and they go away. What happens when their policy turns out to be something that you as a scientist find absolutely shocking and despicable? Are you still happy just to be the silent scientist who watches the policymakers use your data?
Oh, it's a difficult challenge that we are facing every day, of course. But let me say, in the case of, I think, climate science, the evidence became so overwhelming that the world in which we are going to live is going to be an suboptimal world for us as humans. That the nations of the world collectively decided that these levels of global warming should be avoided. So at the level of the negotiations, I don't think the IPC, we've ever run into this problem you've just posed to me. But we do run into that problem when we see that climate change action is not being taken. And despite the policy, we are now next year, for the first time, likely going to exceed the first dangerous level of global warming for the first time. So the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming is now upon us. So at the Global Change Institute, because we do a lot of media engagement and interactions with many important South African policy-making bodies and many different sectors, I think we often do breach. We do often cross that bridge. We cross the line. And we would say, well, based on our science, we think the right course of action is strong climate change mitigation. And it's important for South Africa to contribute its fair share, or for your sector to contribute its fair share to mitigation. So I think in our own interactions, we do become at least advisors in terms of what a policy should be. I still think it is in our own interest not to be prescriptive, but to strongly advise. The moment that you are being seen as having a specific agenda, you are no longer seen as being an objective source of the facts. That's a very difficult trade-off to make. In the negotiations with the countries, the IPCC approach of being seen as an objective source of the facts has worked for the IPCC thus far in terms of getting the right policies in place, as we as scientists see what the right policies are. But the IPCC can unfortunately not claim any success in these policies being converted into action. And that is what is making many climate scientists crossing that line into becoming climate change activists. That is happening increasingly with climate scientists. They become climate change activists. But not yet at the Global Change Institute, colleagues. Don't worry, we're not yet activists.
Tilly, you want to respond to Francois?
I was like, I think we do have to be activists. I think we do. Like we can no longer claim. I so enjoyed having the moral high ground for a long time, but you have to at some point join the fray out with everyone else.
Right, Juliet, can we shift back online? And maybe to be fair to Sally, I think it does make sense to have just one question at a time, especially for those coming from those online. So let's stick to one.
Cool. A question from Prof. Mary Scholes. Thanks, Sally, a great lecture. For me, the greatest challenge is the afforestation regime in Africa. They are using public money and promising solutions that are impossible. The biggest problem is the water use of these millions of trees, and this is often silent. Top impact journals are publishing papers on afforestation as if there were no questions. There isn't a clear question, but I think she's asking what you think about that.
I think that comment of Mary's is really important, and it refers well to what Mike said, because Europeans like trees, so they're very happy to encourage afforestation projects in Africa. So for something that we would consider outrageous, which is planting pine trees across all our beautiful grasslands, is actually something that is being embraced and published in all the journals. But for something that Mike considers totally fine, which is changing the flooding regime, the Europeans aren't even wanting to let people put it on the table. And so I thought someone was going to ask me about the Great Green Wall, Mary, so I actually had a slide. Is there a slide here? The Great Green Wall is just one of these examples of people trying to push afforestation projects in systems that don't necessarily naturally have trees. So my comments about this is that restoration is the wrong word to use. And that, as Mary points out, we cannot ignore the fact that when people have tried to afforest these systems, they have run out of water in their rivers have run dry. We have done it in South Africa, the Chinese have done it. There's plenty of evidence that it can be a dangerous thing to do. And it's kind of immoral that people are not recognizing that. But I also I went to look up on the webpage, and this fourth one, I think this is a great example where using your voice can really help. So it really encouraged me to go for this, because actually, although this initiative started as a plan to plant trees across the Sahel, led by this crazy colleague of mine, Dan Yakir, who did it in Israel, and the water dried up in Israel, but he still put in a project to plant it across. Pretty soon, because people, environmentalists who live and work in this place, engaged with their plan, they have not changed the plan. And the quote is from the website: "The idea that initially inspired the initiative, which is a wall of trees, has now given way to a vision of a mosaic sustainable land use practices." And so this is an example where an idea that is totally incorrect for the ecosystem, if people engage with it using science and using society, you might end up coming out with something that can have benefit. So thanks, Mary.
Okay, we still have a fair amount of time. I'm going to come. Oh, okay. I haven't done two. Come online, Julia. Sorry. Do we have one more on that?
So this is from Prof. Colleen Vogel, who says, Sally, do you think transdisciplinary science has a place, and what does it mean in your work?
Colleen, I usually ask you to answer that for me. Definitely. I think what I was talking about today was not only transdisciplinary, but actually working with people who aren't scientists. But the best way to work with people who aren't scientists is to work with other scientists, because they have done some thinking about how to do that I haven't necessarily. So if I want to engage in action research with a bunch of carbon projects, engaging with manipulating and rewilding projects in Africa, I not only need to manage the relationship with this private company that's trying to make a profit, but I would also really need the advice of social scientists and other types of scientists and economists to help make sure that that process is successful. But I would appreciate your opinion about that.
Let's come back to the room and then we can check if let's just check if Colleen, who's online, wants to respond. Can we get someone who's
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. I was unmuted. So, Sally, I think you answered it absolutely perfectly. Transdisciplinary science isn't just working with other scientists, it's working also with non-scientists in the space. But I think, yeah, if you want to hear all about it, come tomorrow to the panel. And Sally, we hope you'll be there and maybe come and join the panel as well. Thank you very much.
Right, we still have kind of have some time, so I'm going to come back to the room. I have Lucy and I have Jennifer. Since Jennifer hasn't kind of had a go yet, let's start with her.
Thanks, Sally. Really brilliant talk. I've been trying to formulate what this question is, but it's something that sat with me through your talk, which is, on the one hand, how we define a scientist. So some disciplines are really specific about that, and until you have your PhD in that particular field, you are not a scientist, or unless you're practicing as a scientist, you're not a scientist. And I think it's important that we broaden that. But of course, there are then issues about appeal to authority, where people are badging themselves as scientists, whether it's in popular media or in policy engagement. So that's on the one hand of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is for those of us who are scientists in any definition of the word. We've got our science degrees and we work as scientists. We struggle with imposter syndrome, and that prevents us from being the activists, from engaging with policymakers, from being the change makers that we want to be, but we don't feel that we can do enough. And I think in particular about PhD students, postdocs, early career researchers who feel that there are always people who know more than them. There's always the IPCC who are the experts on this topic. And until you are in that group, you don't have a right to have a voice. So thinking about those two ends of the spectrum, how would you visualize you? And I think in many ways you're speaking to your own journey as well, about coming to a point where you are seeing the importance of your role in activism as well as in science. I hope that makes sense, because it wasn't really
let me know if I'm answering your comments. In terms of what is a scientist, I think a scientist is anyone who's willing to change their mind based on the facts when the facts are presented to them. I don't think you need a PhD. You just need to kind of have that, like that's the core of the scientific method. And if you are willing and able to do that and you value that, then you're a scientist. But that's off the top of my head. Then the other one about not feeling like you have enough knowledge or expertise. In a way, I have like this, you need knowledge and expertise to engage in the details of around exactly how much methane is emitted by fires in Africa. To engage as an activist, I mean, I think that's the whole point. Like my second kind of point, which is that I'm going to engage about topics that I actually am not an expert in. I don't understand exactly what would be required to shift our economic system and our social system to become more sustainable. A bit of reading, like most human beings, but you can still have a voice there as long as you don't claim to have any more authority than anyone else. So that's my thought.
Let's go to Lucy, and then I'll come to you.
Thanks, everyone. So this isn't actually so much a question for Sally as a comment following up on slide, which I think to me is something that this whole excellent symposium that Imran question, and so as a comment on a question. So in a way, it's a comment more for, not so much for Sally as for all of us as a community, but maybe particularly for the pro-BC and the DVC research, which is, so we've seen in the last year at Wits, I think the last 2 years at Wits, sort of really great movement in two different ways. One, our systems teams under Ian General doing amazing work in really looking at all the facts and figures and what Wits can do and what Wits can't do. And obviously there's quite a lot that it can't do on its own because it is dependent on the electricity supply of the city to change its carbon use. And then on the other hand, we've got this amazing bunch of scientists at Wits who come together at this symposium that Imran organizes and bring together all this different wealth of research that's happening across the university. But it seems to me that there's sort of a third step, that a third piece of the picture that those two sort of leave out, and that goes to the point you were making, Sally, about what we choose to research and how scientists have their own interests. And so, you know, the university can't come along to each of its scientists and say, well, we want you to work on energy systems for the city, because all the scientists are working on their own things. And so it seems to me that from these two things we've got, Ian Jandrell with his team, systems team, and Imran coordinating all this research across the university, that there's a third piece of the puzzle, which is that of us as a community identifying some areas which would make a key difference to our leading in the city and area and region in the energy transition, whether they are policy areas that could really make a difference to the city, or technology research, like leading in geothermal energy. You know, why don't, and that the university should create professorships, so that we're not just telling the scientists that we already have, who have their interests and the things they're working on, but we pick 3 areas. Maybe city policy is one and geothermal energy is another, but you know, you'll all know what they are, and create posts in the areas that we as a community think will be the most strategic in Wits leading South Africa's energy transition, rather than sort of trying to tell scientists what to work on, or tell Ian to transform the energy system of the city by trying to actually balance Wits's books.
Is that all you're going to do? Is nod your head, Sally?
I think that's a great idea. It would succeed if it was agreed on by the people, because those professorships that you're suggesting would need support from the rest of the community that Imran and Julia are leading. And so it makes sense to discuss it here, I suppose.
I'm going to, I'm going to go in the order that I had the hands up. So over to you, over to you.
Thanks, Imran, and thanks, Sally. A really, really fascinating talk. So I guess it's a question, but it's also a wondering about potential differences and learnings between, say, the natural sciences and the social sciences on this question. And this is a reflection from me as someone I have a degree in both, so kind of having been on the receiving end of teaching broadly within the natural sciences and the social sciences. And there's it's often proclaimed that kind of the natural sciences are value-free, objective, unbiased, and are therefore also given the credibility of those. Whereas my sense is, and I mean, the social scientists can obviously correct me, is that social scientists have engaged more with the question of positionality, values, which also apply to the natural sciences, but maybe then also aren't given the same almost credibility and legitimacy as kind of these objective scientists. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder between the two broad fields, whether they're spaces of learning, because you currently see a lot of kind of activists proclaiming themselves as kind of scholar activists and claiming that quite proudly in their work. And so I wonder whether there are differences by kind of nature in those fields, and whether there should be more kind of scope for engagement on these kinds of questions around ethics, because obviously social scientists have been dealing with questions of poverty, inequality, you know, gender, racism. You know, there's so many ethical questions that have a long tradition in a lot of the social sciences. Thanks.
Over to you, Sally.
I might have to call on Lucy to help me answer that question. I think what you're saying is that because social scientists have actually read the philosophers and realized that the process of work that they're doing that is valuable has a lot of kind of value and positionality ingrained in it. And more physical scientists haven't, then the physical scientists are getting credibility for something that they don't have. They just haven't engaged, they haven't recognized that their work is complex and value laden, and so they're getting society for something that they don't have. Is that kind of what you're saying? That's maybe a bit strong. I'm allowed to say it that way. I think it's true. I don't know much about how science works in the physics field. I've watched with interest how this has changed within ecology. I think many ecologists have now done a lot of thinking about their role here. So one example is E.O. Wilson, who is an amazing biologist that we all have a lot of respect for, but he did support some totally problematic scientists who were engaged in eugenics research, and actually would even the way, not only the choice of subject, but the way that they did the science was laden with their racist attitudes. And it's really hard for biologists to accept that. Even today, we have biologists who are like, no, it's impossible for you, it's impossible. Once you're doing science, you are not being influenced by your opinions and your values. But I think those are in the minority in the discussions I've had. So there's definitely a change in my field. I don't know about physicists.
Julia, should we go online?
Yes, thanks. We have a question from Mike de Pontes. In terms of the Working for Water project within the Eastern and Western Capes and the removal of exotic species which were either consuming or clogging up riverbeds, the carbon removed in many cases became a fire hazard. Jobs were provided for local communities. However, jobs were provided for local communities. Could you comment on this type of benefit/hazard project? And is this still the case in, for example, the Working for Water projects?
That's a great example of something which we would now call a nature-based solution, but that was initiated decades ago already. And the idea was co-benefits. We were going to have more water in the streams, but we would also be creating jobs. From what I know about that, and I have tried to follow the literature, it's very clear that we created jobs and that we empowered people. Not only creating jobs, but giving them pathways into other. So the social benefits are quite clear. The environmental benefits, I think, are less clear because those alien plants are really hard to remove. And so while they could count the number of trees they had cleared, they couldn't really, I don't think anyone has demonstrated that it has resulted in more water in those catchments. The fire hazard is a complex one because, again, it's about how that was implemented. But certainly if they hadn't removed those trees, it would be a much greater fire hazard. And we've done some work to show that how much. So removing alien trees is not only going to help water reserves, it will also prevent risky fires. So I think there are some costs, pros and cons, always trade-offs, but in that case, probably we would all agree as South Africa that the benefits outweigh the costs.
Should we take one more online?
Great. So this is from Amukelani Maluleke. Given that the just transition is highly politicized, what kind of discussions are currently taking place from South African scientists towards informing policy? Sure. Given that the just transition is highly politicized, what kind of discussions are currently taking place from South African scientists towards informing policy, I guess, on just transition?
Perhaps I need to open that one out to the floor. In terms of environmental science, because when you're talking about the just transition in South Africa, we're often talking about losing the jobs from coal mining. And so the discussion is often around coal mining and jobs, in which case there are probably people in the room who can answer it better than I can. From my perspective as an environmental scientist, I think it's around some of the issues that I've addressed today, which is that in a way, a lot of this climate financing is just yet another form of colonialism. It's like the world needs resources. Now they need land resources to store carbon. Africa is a big country. The land is cheap. So it's basically an exploitation of the fact that we have kind of our economies are basically the reason these projects happen in Africa is because it's cheap to do them. And because there's a lot of land, and because the people who are in power, who are deciding where these policies go, happen not to live in Africa, so they're not affected. They get the benefits without the consequences. So that's where I engage. And again, I feel very strongly about this. I have some data to back up some of my opinions, but it stretches beyond science. But if someone wants to talk around the fossil fuel and the coal, perhaps that's a more relevant question.
And I'll take one last question from the room. Mike?
Just listening to this conclusion, I really would ask whether we have done enough to study how policy and politics works. Because in the end, as Francois says, we know what the facts are fairly clear. You can read 6,000 pages of IPCC and you can come away with a great deal of wisdom and certainty about what needs to be done. But what you won't achieve, because it doesn't deal with it, are the dynamics of political decision making. And I really do think that it's a serious gap, and I'd like to hear you talk about it. And since Working for Water was mentioned, let me tell you the story of Working for Water, because in 1994, and it happened in the gents' toilet, which just goes to show how gender politics has changed. The proselytizer of Working for Water approached me because I was then sitting in the Department of Water and said, we want to solve the alien invasion problem because it uses so much water. And we could do it by chemical treatment, or we could do it mechanically, or we thought about doing it by sort of labor-based, but that's going to be very complicated. And I've just been finishing a public works program for government, saying we have to find areas where we can do useful work on a labor-based. And I said to him, if you're interested in chemicals or mechanical clearing, just go away. If you're going to turn this into a labor-based project, it'll run. And that was the origin of Working for Water, is that the intention had been to clear aliens as cheaply as possible. And the compromise, the policy compromise, which was reached informally, as I say, in the gents' toilet, was to say, if you don't do this in labor base, it's not going to happen. And the compromise was to say, let's do it on the labor base. Now, I think policy is quite often made very informally, but it reflects the balances within the society, which if you have got those balances understood and you can work within them, can become effective. Now, you can do that at a country level, and we have enough trouble in coal-dependent communities in Mpumalanga to say it's not even easy at country level. Trying to do it at international level with different powers and different forces becomes even more difficult. But if we don't talk about the political economy and the political science behind it, I don't think solutions. We inform lots of options, but that critical last step of how do you get to the decision? How do you get to a Paris agreement? How do you get to the next steps? I think really does require more attention, whether we do enough policy work, policy studies work to understand how those things happen. So I'd like to throw that as a challenge, given all the intellect and the knowledge that we have here, decisions. How are we trying to think about and organize to affect decisions? And we don't want to be dirty our hands. At least how do we advise those who want to try and do that? Anyone to? Yeah.
I have anything more to add, except maybe there's some people who study politics in the room who want to speak, like you are. Exactly the point I made, which is that this problem is not something that I as an environmental scientist can solve. It's a problem for people who don't have my skills, but as an activist.
Great. So we've come to the end of our time. Celia, I'll just give you the last word in case you want to say anything general or kind of anything in response to all of the questions.
Well, I suppose I'm pleased that it's something that appears to hit home for many people. And I haven't yet had anyone disapprove of my two-prong approach. I mean, in a way, it's a little bit trying to have your cake and eat it. but perhaps that's how I'm going to have to move forward. So that's going to be my plan, two-prong approach.
Great. So I think we kind of unfortunately have to bring this to a close. Let me ask you to kind of join me in thanking Sally for a fantastic talk. And for kind of really providing us with some pretty deep thinking on the dilemmas of being a scientist in the world, and in kind of trying to grapple with the challenges that we face. Thank you so much, Sally. So can I just thank all of those who were involved in kind of organizing the event. It's quite easy to be the pro VC and say, let's make this happen. There's a large number of people, and you know who kind of who you all are, who make it possible for us to kind of have these events, and make it possible for us to share our university's expertise with a much larger group of people. So thank you so much to kind of all of you. For those of you who are here with us today from Wits, we kind of look forward to having you here again tomorrow. And for those who were not here and are not part of it, please kind of look out for our events kind of around climate change. We have quite a few exciting speakers lined up. If you're not on the mailing list, please can email julia.taylor@wits.ac.za, and we'll be happy to can in that way keep you informed of all of the activities. So thank you everyone, and a special thank you to you, Sally.